So after each year's government phase, we've got a spring season, which consists of command phase, combat phase. So each player, if he wants, plays a card which has got a value, a number, a letter, and the season. So starting with the first player in turn order, they may choose to commit a card face down, then the other players as well, and in the end we all reveal our cards and we play our commands for the season. So for example, if we play this card in spring, we can use it to move 6 units. This means the 6 number is the number of commands you have to move your units, and the letter determines the turn order for this season. So if the Soviet player, for example, plays this one and the Japanese player plays this one card in spring, then the Soviet player plays first, because in alphabetical order C comes first. So the Soviets will play first and move 4 units. Then we've got possibly a combat phase in which we resolve the battles. And then we've got the Japanese player moving 6 units because he's got the I letter. And after all players finish their movement and subsequent command phases, we've got one supply phase for all players, during which we check our units for supply and possibly attrition. And then we move on to the next season, which would be summer and fall and possibly winter. Now, I would like to talk about it in a reverse way. I would like to talk about the supply first, because this is to a large extent the goal of the game, to cut your opponent off supply, and because this will allow us to touch on some sensitive aspects of the game. So, we are at the end of the spring season. All players have finished their command phases and possible combat phases, and this is time to check for supply. We've got these Japanese guys here. These are all 1 combat values, and we've also got an American guy here, and we've got this kind of units here. It's time to check for supply. We check all ground units to see if they can trace a supply line to a supply source. Now, let me break this up a bit. So, these are called ground units. We've got infantry, tanks, forts, and in this game we've also got the SNLF Marines and the American US Marines. These are collectively called ground units. And let me not forget, we've also got these units, which are militia units, and they operate in China only. They cannot exit China. The rest of the units, which is submarines, fleets, and carriers, and also air forces, these are collectively called ANS units, which stands for Air, Naval, Submarine units. So these are ANS units, and the rest of it is ground units. We check the ground units for supply attrition. So any unit that is unsupplied will lose 1 step or will be reduced by 1 combat value. Exception, fortresses. So let's exclude fortresses from this procedure. Fortresses are never unsupplied. They can be built, as we have noted previously, anywhere on the map, and they need no supply. Infantries and tanks need the supply. Also the US Marines, for example, they need to trace some supply. So for example, if Japan is at war with the US and this guy is trapped in this island of Guam, then they are surrounded and they cannot trace supply back to their homeland, so they will die of attrition. An exception to that, besides the forts, is the Japanese SNLF Marines in islands and straits. So, while the US Marines need to trace supply, the Japanese SNLF Marines are tough guys. They are specialists in invading islands, and they need no supply to survive in an island. They will withstand this attrition step even if surrounded by enemies. I remind you that there can only be 1 SNLF per island area. So, the supply line needs to be traced to a supply source. A supply source for each faction is its main capital or subcapital, as long as they control it. So at the start of the game, the US player is controlling Los Angeles and Nanking. So each of those can work as a supply source. They don't control New Delhi because the British Empire starts as neutral. So this is not a supply source before the British actively join the war. And another note is that you cannot conquer another player's subcapital and treat it as your own supply source. Only factional capitals or subcapitals work as supply sources for your units. So, in order to trace supply to a supply source, you need to trace a chain of friendly areas. So this is time to talk about friendly control in land and sea areas. So who controls each area? First of all, if there is only one unit of one faction occupying a space, then this space is controlled by that unit's faction. So the Japanese, of course, are controlling Marianas. But if there are two units of two different factions, then this area is termed disputed. So while this one is undisputed, this one is disputed among the US player and the Japanese player. So the owner of this land area is the one who has been there the longest. In this case, let's assume that the Japanese were there first and built the fort. So we will flip this upright as all the blocks are during the game. So the owner's unit is hidden. We don't know for sure what this is. And the American player is the invader. He has invaded this island with the US Marine and is called the aggressor. So the Japanese is the owner and this is the aggressor. The one in control of this island is the Japanese player. I remind you that in disputed areas, units cannot be built. And I will also remind you that unsupplied units cannot be built, with the exception of forts and SNLF Marines for the Japanese. Also, let's note that these guys, the militias, do not need supply, but we shall talk about them in detail when talking about China. And in this game, unlike our Triumph and Tragedy system, this restriction also applies to the ANS units. So you cannot build up your fleets or air forces if they are unsupplied. They don't die to attrition, of course, this only applies to ground units, but you cannot promote them if they are unsupplied. Now back to controlling an area. As long as a sea area is occupied only by units of a rival faction, thus a faction you are not at war with, you can enter this sea area. This is friendly to you. So for example, if the US is at peace with the Japanese, they can enter this sea area. This is termed open seas because it is not occupied by enemy units, so you can freely pass. The international treaties are in effect and you can peacefully and safely pass through this sea area. However, if you are at war with this unit's faction, then the Americans cannot enter this territory without fighting a battle. So this sea is occupied by the Japanese and it is enemy seas to the Americans. So when tracing supply from Guam, you cannot trace it through this or this or this sea area. So this guy is unsupplied because all adjacent sea areas are occupied by the enemy, the Japanese. So this one will lose one combat value and possibly be eliminated. Now, back into controlling an area. When an area is unoccupied, of course, if it is a sea area, it is open seas for everyone. But if it is a land area and it is unoccupied, then it depends on whether it is home territory or a colony or a neutral nation. So, home territory, when unoccupied, always is controlled by the initially owning faction. So, these areas of Japan, when unoccupied, always belong to Japan. It is a different case when talking about colonies or neutral nations. When you conquer a neutral nation, either diplomatically or militarily, you place your control marker, the control marker of your faction. In order to control it, you have to control its capital. So, for example, if you have entered and conquered Saigon, you place your control marker, and you have also got control of the North Vietnam area, the capital being Hanoi, as long as it is unoccupied. So, in this case, the British are alone in Hanoi and are controlling it. But if they leave this area, for example, then it reverts to Soviet control because the Soviets have conquered Vietnam, they control the capital Saigon, and they have also got control of the unoccupied North Vietnam area. So this is very important when determining supply for a unit. The same applies for colonies. When you conquer a colony, which of course will be militarily, you will place your own influence marker. So, for example, Bismarck is a colony of the British Empire. If the Soviets, for example, for some inexplicable reason managed to reach here and add their control, now this colony remains controlled by the Soviets, even if they vacate it and leave it unoccupied. But of course, if another faction comes with their ground unit, because only ground units may take control, then they remove this and place their own influence marker. Or if it is the Americans, they just remove it and they leave it without any control marker to remind it the control reverts back to the British. Back to the supply check. You can only trace supply through friendly land areas and open seas. So, for example, if the Japanese are here and they have to trace a supply line back to Japan, or Mukden at least, then they have to trace it through friendly areas. So these ones do not qualify unless they are occupied and controlled by Japanese units. So for example, now this 1 combat value tank is in supply because it can trace the supply line through here and here and here, or possibly here. So it is supplied. If there was not this infantry unit here, then this land area would have its control revert back to the nationalist China because it is home territory. So the tank is unsupplied because it can't trace supply through here, neither through here, because this one is a neutral nation and the control initially belongs to this neutral nation until conquered by somewhere. So this one is unsupplied and will be eliminated. And now we've also got to take the straits into account and also the islets. So islets work much like straits. So for example, this Kyushu islet base, or this Visayas Strait, or this Palmyra islet, or the Gilbert's islet group, all work in the same way, which is the following. You can trace supply through neutral straits or rival straits or islets, of course, because at the start of the game there are international treaties allowing you to move through rival straits and neutral straits, of course. So you can trace the supply line through here if you are at peace with the Americans who are controlling this strait. But if you're at war with the Americans, then the supply line cannot be traced through here. This is an enemy area for this purpose. And of course, you cannot trace supply through impassable areas like this one, for example. Basically, these are out of play for all game purposes. And you cannot trace supply through these borders, which are impassable. You cannot pass through this because these are steep mountains. So you cannot trace a supply line from here to here. Let's make one thing clear. Control of an area is evaluated at the start of a phase. So, for example, we've got a Japanese plane stationed here, and this is in control of Nanking. So, this is the start of the movement phase. The Japanese move this airplane here. Now, at the start of a phase, which would be the combat phase, this one area would revert back to nationalist Chinese control because it is unoccupied. So at the start of a phase, at the start of the combat phase, the Japanese have lost control of this one. And this may possibly affect their retreat after battle and other features. And as you're gonna see later, this Air Force is going to be in big trouble because of losing this control. But for now, I would like you to never forget this golden rule, that control is evaluated at the start of the phase, and this can of course affect your supply lines because supply phase comes after the combat phase, and during the combat maybe the control of some regions have been changed. So on with the movement phase. It is the summer season and we have played the spring card of letter of C and 4 command value. This means we can command 4 units and we can move them. Of course, once more, the forts cannot move. We have to select which unit we move and determine whether we move them by land movement or sea movement or air movement. These are the 3 types of movement depending on our unit's identity. We can move our ground units by land movement, which means moving them through land areas. So if we move this unit, we will move it through land areas. And in this case, straits are treated both as land and sea areas. This is the golden rule. So you can do a land movement through here and move on. And you can also use this for sea movement, as we're going to see later. So during land movement, you move through land areas and straits or islet groups, for example, in this case. The sea movement can only be conducted by naval units like carriers and fleets and submarines. During naval movement, you move through sea areas and straits or islets or islet bases, and you stop upon encountering a coastal land area. So for example, if this submarine reaches this coastal area, which means a land area adjacent to sea, it should stop its sea movement. Also, the naval units can use land movement in order to move to the adjacent coast. So in this case, this unit, instead of conducting a sea movement and moving all the way around, it will only do this land movement to move to the adjacent coast. Because, for example, the sea is occupied by an enemy and you don't want to fight a battle, so you will move to the adjacent coast. So there is a land movement, sea movement, and also air movement. The air movement is pretty simple. You just move over land or sea alike. So you can cross this sea and move here, or go through land and end up here. However, if an air force ends its movement at sea, its next move should be towards an undisputed friendly land area for fuel purposes. So the airplane will patrol the sea area and end up here, possibly. And in the next round, it has to refuel and end up at the friendly undisputed land area. Now, the distance its unit may move is summarized in this chart. So fortresses can't move, of course, and then we've got pretty much all units except for fleets and carriers at sea, which can move 3 spaces, and tanks that can move 3 spaces. All the rest can move up to 2 spaces. So, for example, this submarine can move 2 spaces, or this air force can move 2 spaces, but a tank from here may move up to 3 land spaces. Generally, each space you enter costs 1 movement point, no additional movement costs, with the exception of these ones, which are the oceans, the darker blue ones, which cost 2 movement points each. So, for example, if a carrier with its movement allowance of 3 was to move here, this would mean 2 movement points, and this would require a further 2 movement points to reach North Pacific Ocean. And if we are talking for a submarine with its movement allowance of 2, it can use 1 movement point to reach here, and then in order to enter one of the 2 oceans, this would require 2 additional movement points. And when a ground unit wants to conduct a sea movement, it is temporarily turned into a convoy. So, for example, if this infantry wants to land at Iwo Jima, it shall conduct a sea movement. Now, here it is a convoy, and here it becomes a ground unit again. So, after ending its movement here, it will end its movement as a convoy, and during the subsequent phase, it can possibly land here or sea invade an area. And we shall talk about sea invasion later, but just keep this in mind for now. Now, what happens with borders? We've got some beautiful features on this map, which are called borders, like this one, which is a mounted border. And this is all summarized in this chart. Now, you don't have to be particularly concerned with borders when moving peacefully, but when engaging the enemy, this limits your movement. Let's talk about this more in detail. So, we've got this nationalist Chinese militia, which conducts a land movement. He can move here, or of course, here. And in this case, we've got a plains border, and in this case, we've got a river border. Nothing restrains this movement, but if you're engaging an enemy, then you are limited by this border. So, engaging means entering an area where there is an enemy. Disengaging, of course, means starting your movement in an area with an enemy and moving out of it. During a certain season, you can only cross a border in order to engage or disengage an enemy with a maximum of a given number of units, which depends on the border. So this is a river border, so it's got a border limit of 1. So only one unit may cross this border to engage the enemy. In this case, it would be the militia. And if there was an American guy here, he would, of course, be able to cross another border and fight the Japanese. But he couldn't do this type of movement because this would violate this border. Only one unit can pass through. And in this case, let's suppose that this area is occupied. One unit may engage the enemy at Nanking through here, and the other unit may engage through here, because it might be a river, but you cross it through a different border. This also applies to disengaging. So, for example, if all these areas were occupied, you cannot use this small border to engage and disengage at the same time. The limit is 1 unit, and we are always talking about ground units. ANS units, like air forces and submarines, for example, are exempt from this restriction. This only concerns the ground units. When disengaging, you have to disengage into a friendly area. So, for example, this Soviet infantry is engaged with the Japanese infantry, and it's the Soviet turn. They want to disengage from this fight, so can do it either in Irkutsk or in Never, or they can disengage into Mongolia, for example, which in this example is Soviet controlled. And upon disengaging, after disengaging, they can continue their movement onto pretty much wherever they want. So they can go into Hailar, which is a Japanese controlled territory. But because it is empty of enemy units, they can continue their movement here. The only thing they cannot do is re-engaging, so they cannot move into Jehol and engaging this Japanese SNLF marine. So this move is allowed, and this one as well, but this one is not, because you're not allowed to re-engage. This one would be a very smart move, because now in this case the Soviets gain control of Hailar and cut this Japanese infantry off supply. So this one, because all these territories are Soviet control, is surrounded and it will suffer attrition. Also, you can disengage into empty seas and then continue your movement elsewhere. Again, following the above-mentioned rule of not re-engaging the enemy. And now on to strategic movement. During strategic movement, units may move double their normal movement allowance, but moving only through friendly areas and without engaging or disengaging the enemy. So, for example, the Japanese are controlling all these areas and they want to move this submarine through sea movement. They can move this strategically, so instead of the usual 2, they can move it further and reach possibly this area to a maximum of 4 spaces because it's strategic movement. Once more, the preconditions are that you are neither engaging the enemy nor disengaging from an enemy, possibly, and you move strictly through friendly areas, which of course includes open seas. And when it comes to using straits for your strategic movement, you can only use straits for strategic movement if these are yours. No rival straits, even if you are at peace with America, nor neutral straits like Hainan, for example. And the same goes for islets and islet groups and islet bases. So, again, when conducting strategic movement, in order to double your movement allowance, if you want to use a strait, it has to be yours. So, suppose Japan has never invaded Mindanao and they are at peace with US. So, in this case, while you can use the strait for normal movement, like 1, 2, 3, you cannot, however, use it for strategic movement in order to double your movement allowance. It goes without saying that you must stop when encountering an enemy. An exception to that is the air forces and the submarines, because the submarines can bypass the enemy while at sea. They can move through the enemy. And the same applies to the air forces, which they can fly over the enemy during their air movement. Now, strategically moving, the air forces may only conduct strategic air movement from a friendly land area to a friendly land area again, and both of these need to be undisputed. So you are here, and because of fuel shortages, you just move strategically to a maximum of 4 spaces, which could possibly be 1, 2, 3, 4. You land in Kwajalein and you refuel. You cannot end your movement at sea or start your strategic movement at sea. This could only be a normal move, not a strategic one. Okay, so what happens if you play a card of the wrong season? There are cards for spring, summer, and fall. There are no cards for winter, which is a special phase, and we're gonna talk about this shortly. But if you play a card for the wrong season, you don't get the full command value of it. You only get the so-called emergency command. So you disregard this number, the command value, the letter applies normally, and you only do an emergency command move. So let me clarify this first. If you play 2 cards that both feature an E letter, because one of them is for the wrong season, then the opponent decides whether they want to play first or not. And after that, when your turn comes, you can only move a maximum of 2 units, because the emergency command has only got a value of 2, regardless of the number indicated as a command value of the particular card. And an exception to that is the Americans, which have got an emergency command of 4. So if the Americans play a wrong season, they move up to 4 units. And if the Japanese or Soviets play a wrong season, they only get an emergency command of 2. And under emergency command, you cannot conduct any form of aggression, which is attacking a neutral or other player, and which we are going to talk about shortly. Of course, you can strategically move under the above mentioned restrictions, but you are only conducting peaceful moves. You are not attacking or aggressing an enemy. Okay, so time to talk about aggressing. Aggressing means either entering a rival's land territory or attacking their units. For example, we've got the Japanese that are here in Suzhou and they move to Wuhan. This is aggression because this land is undisputed and occupied by the Chinese nationalists, and the Japanese enter it. This is aggression. They are going to fight a battle, and the Japanese are trying to gain control over this area. The other instance is when, for example, you attacking a unit. For example, the Japanese are at war with the Americans, and they are occupying this sea. So, in order for the Americans to pass through, they move here and stop their movement in order to fight a battle. This is also called aggression because the sea was occupied by the Japanese and the Americans are the aggressors in this case. So, when trying to gain control over the owning faction, you conduct an aggression and you are the aggressor, and the other faction is the owner. So, when aggressing a neutral by moving units into their territory, this is called violation of neutrality. And when attempting to aggress an enemy faction or great power for the first time, you need to declare war upon them. So, for example, if this is the American colony and the Japanese are aggressing by moving units into it, they have to declare war upon the Americans if they have not already done so previously. So, let's talk about violating a neutral first. First of all, by conducting a violation of neutrality, you have to declare it before moving any number of units into this territory. And upon declaring the violation of neutrality, the neutral nation becomes an armed neutral. So it deploys its forces in the form of forts. The fort's combat value depends again on the master value of the nation's capital or city, just as if you were turning this into your satellite diplomatically. So, if you conquered Changsha diplomatically, you would have summoned the 2 combat value unit of any type. But in this case, because the Japanese are entering Changsha, Changsha is defending itself by deploying a 2 combat value fort. So these orange ones are the neutral forts and they will defend their land area. If the Japanese manage to destroy this fort and thus gaining control of the capital, then they place their control marker and this nation is conquered until it possibly changes control to another faction. When conducting a violation of neutrality, all other players, the rival factions, gain some diplomacy cards or action cards, which are called world reaction cards. The number of world reaction cards they draw depends on the capital's master value. Exception: when you violate a Chinese neutral nation, the world reaction cards number is always 1. So, if the Japanese want to violate Vietnam, the master value of its capital, Saigon, is 2. So, before moving any of their units inside, Vietnam will spawn a 2 combat value fort here and a 1 combat value fort here in Hanoi. And all other players will draw 2 action cards, which is equal to Saigon's master value. But if instead the Japanese violate Changsha, the enemies will only draw 1 action card regardless of the capital's master value. Thematically, this is because it is China and is already at a state of civil war, so the world reaction is not so big. Let's put it like this. So when a foreign power violates a neutral in China, the world reaction cards drawn are always 1, just 1, regardless of the capital's master value. And if it is Chinese violating a neutral, like this one for example, or this one, nobody draws any cards. Simply put, when Chinese are fighting Chinese, it's just Wednesday. Just remember this. Now, as long as the armed neutral stands firm and defends its territory, so as long as this fort is still alive, other players may enter the territory. So in the case of Vietnam again, let's suppose that the Japanese have failed to destroy the fort in Saigon, and it's the turn of another faction like the US. They are not at war with the Japanese yet, so they may attack another territory of Vietnam themselves, like northern Vietnam, without causing any world reaction. In this case, they are attempting to gain control of northern Vietnam and cause a partition of Vietnam. So if they destroy this fort, they will gain control of this territory without needing to declare war upon the Japanese, and the Japanese may conquer this territory for themselves. Another case is intervention, which means an enemy of the invading faction or violating faction entering the territory with a ground unit. So in this case, the Japanese are trying to conquer Vietnam, and they are at war with the US. So a US ground unit, namely this US Marine, enters North Vietnam or South Vietnam, and because they are enemies of the Japanese, are considered friends to the Vietnamese under the rule, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So they declare intervention in Vietnam before moving any of their units, and at the end of their movement they can substitute all these forts with their remaining combat value, which could be a 1 or 2 for example, and if this was a 1, they would substitute it with any combat value unit. So once more, if it is just a rival at peace with the Japanese, they may attempt a partition by splitting the territory among the conquerors, but if they are enemies to each other, they may declare intervention and save Vietnam from the invaders, thus substituting all remaining forts with the units of equal combat value belonging to the intervening faction. It goes without saying that the communists start as enemies to the nationalists in China. So if they try to violate a neutral as communists, for example, and if a neutral fort is spawned here, the enemies may immediately intervene and substitute this fort for themselves, and subsequently gaining control of the territory. However, the usual nationality restrictions apply, which means if the Soviets, for example, intervene into a Japanese invaded Mongolia, they will exchange the remaining combat value of units with a Soviet unit. But if they intervene into a Chinese province, for example, then this will be converted to a Red Chinese unit. And the same goes for the Americans. If the Americans intervene into a Chinese province, then the remaining units will be converted to nationalist Chinese units. Or if the intervention takes place in Indochina, this will become British Empire units of any type. And if it is elsewhere, this will become American units. Now, time to talk about violating the proxy powers. The proxy powers, once more, start as rivals to the great powers. So, Japanese, for example, are at peace with the nationalist China and the communist China as well. But if they enter a nationalist China territory, for example, they have to declare a violation of a proxy power. Because this is an aggression against the proxy power, they're entering their territory. Proxy powers can aggress the great powers at their own discretion without any penalties. So, for example, if this Chinese militia moves and attack the Japanese in Qingdao, then there is no penalty for this, neither for the US faction nor for the proxy power itself. They can do so because it is China, and they can move here and attack. But if the Japanese player fires back at his own combat phase, then this is considered aggression against the proxy power, as is invading a proxy power's territory, and this requires a violation of a proxy power. So in this case, we use this marker, which means that the Japanese are no longer at peace with nationalist China, and this means two things. First of all, the level of loyalty for the Kuomintang, the nationalist Chinese, is raised by one level because of the Japanese violation. And second, the foster faction, which in this case is the US, draws two action cards as a reaction. Same with the communist faction or the Red China. If the Japanese attack them, then the CPC level, which is the loyalty to the communist regime, is raised by one level because of the violation. And also the Soviet player, which is their foster faction, draws two action cards as a consolation prize. And we again use this marker, which means peace with Red China. We flip it to the other side just to indicate that, of course, the violation only happens once, and from now on there is no further penalty for the Japanese, for example. And it goes without saying that the Soviets can, of course, violate nationalist China as well for the same effect. And the US player, of course, can violate Red China as well for the same effect. So, we're now going to talk about sea invasion. During your movement phase, you can move your ground units in order to invade the land area overseas. So, for example, you cross this sea and invade. The border limit for a coast is 1, and it's always a 1 when you invade a land area, even if it is undefended. This is an exception. So if you are a Japanese player and this is an empty land area of the British, you can only invade with one unit through this border. But of course, you can invade through this border with another unit. So whether it is undefended or not, and after having respected the border limits, which is always a responsibility of the phasing player. So for example, because these units are always hidden in actual gameplay, if there is no battle conducted here, it's the responsibility of the Japanese player to respect this rule and only move one ground unit through this border, for example, not a second one. After that, we may possibly conduct a battle, and it's a bit early to talk about the combat phase yet, but long story short, this unit will not be attacking because it's a ground unit conducting a sea invasion. So in this round, they are just regrouping at the coast and they will not be attacking. Japanese SNLF Marines or the US Marines are an exception to this rule because they attack during the same phase. So, time to talk about the winter season. This is a particularly useful season not only for the Soviets, but also for the other factions in this game, because this is the Pacific theater, not Europe. So Japanese and Americans may also use this season to redeploy their units. So, in winter, the Soviets may do a winter movement within Soviet Union only. So, let's focus on this area for now. Let's suppose that the Japanese have invaded the Soviet Union and it is winter. only the Soviets may use this season to move their units within Russia. So they can play a command card for any season, spring, summer, or fall, and they use the full command value of the card. And of course, the letter also applies. So the Soviets will play a G8, which means they can move 8 units within Russia only, not outside Russia, nor units coming from another area into Russia, just within Russia. And they can even use this particular border, which works differently in winter. This is a mountain border, which allows only a movement of one ground unit in order to engage or disengage. But during winter, this Lake Baikal freezes, so you can use it to move a second unit. So they conduct their movement phase within Russia, and then there's a combat phase following within Russia only. And after that, you conduct a supply phase for units within Russia only. As for the other factions, they use this season to do strategic redeployments. Strategic redeployments means, again, using your card's full command value, but you can only move your units, either normally or strategically, into your bases or home territory. So for the Japanese, they can move their units here or here, for example. Thematically, it means that they are just withdrawing some troops to regroup them and rebuild them during the winter and the subsequent production phase so that they are ready for the next year.